When you're ready for me, just say,
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give people the chance to come in from the waiting room. My name is Maria. I'll be in the background as tech support. I just have a couple of little announcements. So we have Science Demystified on next Monday. So usually it's at the beginning of the month, but because of all the holidays, it's going to be next Monday, 2 o'clock in person and on Zoom. And also our big book sale is the weekend of the 26th, 27th, and the Bonsai Collective will be here as well. So those of you who like coming in for that, please come and see our big used book sale. And now, without further ado, here is Mr. Hershey Dwoskin. Friendly reminder, he'll be back in the library in person next week.
yeah. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you again on Zoom. I remember doing this for so long during the year and a half or so of COVID, and I hope you can hear me well and see me well, thanks to our tech support. And to start off with, I thought I would come up with a kind of we'll call it a confession. And my confession is this. That I want to speak today about American politics. We haven't touched that subject since the new session began. And I have to say that without taking any sides in this whole particular election, I would have thought that since the last election, since Trump lost the last election to Biden, by 7.5 million votes, and he lost in the Electoral College quite considerably. That whatever happened since that election would have reinforced the support for the Democrats and taken it away from the Republicans because of Trump's behavior on January 6th, because of an economy in the U.S. that has improved from the depths that it sank after COVID, and the changeover of candidates from Biden to Harris. Putting all those things together, I said to myself, well, how many people who voted for Trump last time would vote for Harris this time? And how many people who voted for Harris or Biden last time would change to vote to Trump this time? And I figured it was a no brainer. I said to myself, well, it seems obvious that there were many more reasons for Republicans to change to Democrats than for Democrats to change to Republicans. Maybe that's just the way I see things. But if you check out the polling of pretty consistently since the contest began, the polls are showing exactly the opposite. That the margin that was won by Biden last time, which it was 4.5%, that just in the polls alone, Harris has not gained that advantage over Trump this time. So what that means is that either there's been a lot of switchovers, or that people who voted for Harris last time aren't voting this time, and people who didn't vote for Trump last time are voting this time. So it is really quite a close contest, as everybody knows. There certainly is no way to know at this point what the results are going to be, and even the expert pollsters will tell you they have no clue. And so I wanted to, especially for people who don't really understand in depth how the American president is selected, I thought I would go back and give an explanation about the Electoral College. And I know that I have spoken sometimes about this, but years and years back. So I think it's worthwhile to re-emphasize this. And one of the points I wanted to emphasize is simply that America has a unique system. There is no other country in the world that runs their presidential elections in this way. There are a lot of different ways that a president is chosen around the world in democracies, but nobody uses this complicated, construed, um, uh, difficult, system as the Americans have selected. That's one point. The second point is that since the American Republic was founded in 1787 and the first elections were in 1788, by and large, I mean, I'm not going to say completely, of course, but by and large, they've kept the electoral college system in place from then till now. How exactly the mechanism of it works has changed a little bit, but the whole philosophy behind it and the whole mechanism of a semi-indirect election system that has been preserved really for 250 odd years. And so I think it's worthwhile to look at it, to try to find out what the reasons are for it, and also to try to understand why it's so difficult to make any changes, if necessary, to this system. But before we do that, let's just talk about how, in general, what are the different methods of selecting a head of state in different places around the world. And there's several common methods. One, of course, is by direct vote, which is that you have a direct vote for a president, and whoever gets the most votes wins. So in France, they do a system like that. And if on the first round, nobody gets more than half the vote, they'll hold a second round with the top two candidates, and whoever gets the most votes wins. So that's one, a direct election, a direct selection system for a head of state. Of course, we all know that in the British world, that in the parliamentary system, the head of state is selected by, or the prime minister, won't say head of state, we'll say the prime minister, is selected in a bit of an indirect way, where people just vote for their local representatives, and whichever party gets the most representatives, the leader of that party becomes the leader of the country. So that's a system common to many different countries, especially those who descend from the British parliamentary system. Another way of doing it is to have the representatives who are elected in the parliament select themselves who the head of state will be. And it's a bit of a difference from the second example that I gave, because sometimes the votes don't exactly go along party lines. It's not automatic that the leader of the biggest party himself gets to be the president. But in that system, all the people in the parliament will pick somebody else who's not in the parliament to be the head of state in that way. So those are three democratic ways to elect the leader of a country. And, it's hard to pick one or the other to say which is better, because each country has to pick what suits itself and what it goes in its own traditions. But in the United States, they looked at some of these ideas. But we have to remember that the United States was really the first democracy in the world. So they didn't have an example or a sample of which way to follow to elect their head of state. All they had in those days were monarchies who, the sons, of course, or daughters, but mostly the sons, inherited the throne after either the death of their predecessor or by killing their predecessor and claiming the throne themselves. So the Americans had to come up with a system kind of all on their own. And they did look at the various possibilities before selecting the system that they selected. And it took a long time for the leaders of America, including John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and other of the great names that you know about. It took them a long time to sort of figure out what the best system would be. And they had to balance off the interests of different parties, different states, different classes in society before they came up to the system that they invented or came up with. Um, the system that they came up with is something called the Electoral College. And the Electoral College members cast what's called electoral votes. So the Electoral College is simply a name for the group of people who gathered together at the end of an American election and who cast votes representing the votes that their individual states cast in the presidential election. And those votes that they cast are called electoral votes. And whoever gets the most electoral votes will win the election. Now, if there are more than two candidates, and which hasn't happened since George Wallace ran, but if there are more than two candidates who win electoral votes, and after the vote is taken, nobody gets more than half of them, then the entire election is canceled, believe it or not. None of the votes that anybody cast in the election count for anything. And the House of Representatives then chooses the president on the basis of one state, one vote. So I believe this has happened really only once in American history, back in the very early 1800s, and it hasn't happened since. But if you might recall, the last election, Donald Trump was trying to get his vice president, Mr. Pence, not to certify the votes of the election. And if the votes of the election were not certified, then the House of Representatives would end up choosing the president on the basis of one state, one vote, which means that there are 50 states, and whoever got 26 votes would win the election. And since the Republicans dominate more states than the Democrats do, Trump would have won the election had the House of Representatives decided on the vote. So how did they come up with sort of this, we'll call it a cockamamie system, a very indirect way, a direct and indirect way of electing the president? Because obviously the votes of the people count to choose the president, but it's not the president, not the candidate who gets the most votes who wins. It's the candidate who gets the most electoral votes who wins. And this was a system that was argued about and was compromised over before the United States was set up as a democracy. So by the time the very first election took place in 1788, this system was already in place. It's, like I said, it's been in place ever since. So how did this come about? And what was the motivations of the founders of the country to come up with such a convoluted and indirect system? We'll call it a direct, indirect system. Well, first of all, let's just go into a touch more detail about how the system works in the first place, which is that the elections that take place in the United States are really not one election, but 50 separate elections. In other words, each state has its own election on the very same day. And with the exception of two states, Maine and Nebraska, whoever wins the most votes in that particular state gets all of the electoral votes that are allotted to that state. And then all those electoral votes are counted up, and whoever has the most electoral votes over the number, whoever gets a majority of the electoral votes wins the election. That's how the formality of the system is set up. How are the electoral votes distributed? Each state has the same number of electoral votes as they have the number of senators plus members of the House of Representatives added up together. So since each state has 2 senators and each state has a minimum of 1 representative, the minimum number of electoral votes per state is 3, and there is no maximum. So the number of electoral votes are allotted by the number of congressional districts in each state. So the very small states like Vermont or North Dakota or South Dakota or Delaware have 3 electoral votes each because they have only 1 House of Representative member. And the largest state, which is California, has 54 electoral votes, which is 52 members of the House of Representatives plus 2 senators. So if you add up to the total, it comes to 538 altogether in the United States. And at the very beginning, the first election, there were only 81 electoral votes. So now there's 538, meaning that you need to get 270 in order to win. But how do they know how many electoral votes each state is supposed to have? So that's determined by the census that's taken place every 10 years. And the census is supposed to count the number of residents, not the number of citizens, not the number of eligible voters, but the number of people living in that state, including children, including immigrants who don't have status, including everybody who lives in that state gets counted. And that number is then officially published, and then the number of electoral votes are based on the number of people living in each and every state. So every 10 years then, the number of electoral votes or the number of districts in the House of Representatives changes depending on how population has changed over the last 10 years. And I have some really interesting figures to tell you about later to show how greatly this number has changed over the years. It's just quite remarkable. If we just look at the last election to this election, meaning the Biden-Trump election to this election, overall, there have been a number of changes in the electoral votes that have been given out to the different states. So, for example, let me see now here. Oregon and North Carolina and Florida and Texas and Montana have each gained 1 electoral vote. Texas gained 2 electoral votes. And California, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and New York each lost 1 electoral vote. So in other words, there was a changeover of 6 electoral votes that were taken away from the slower growing states and added to the quicker growing states. If you apply these 6 changes to the election of last time, the Democrats have lost 5 and gained 2, so they're -3, and the Republicans are therefore +3. So just by looking at the very same election results of last time, the Republicans would have gained 3 electoral votes in this particular election. Now, just to give you a couple of numbers, and maybe we'll do it a little more afterward. In the 1852 election, California had 4 electoral votes. They now have 54. From 1932 to 1948, New York State had 47 electoral votes. They now have 28. Up until 1960, West Virginia had 8 electoral votes. They now have 4. So it means that, of course, populations shifting around, either moving from the states that were slower growing or just staying the same, and other people going to the faster growing states, that changes the proportion of electoral votes that each state has. And in general, the southern states, especially the western states, have grown in population, and therefore their power has grown in the United States as a whole. There are two states that don't use this winner-take-all system, which is Maine and Nebraska. And there, what they do is they'll say, okay, we will give 2 electoral votes to the winner of the state, or 3 in the case of Nebraska, and each electoral district in the state will get its own electoral vote. So Maine has 4 electoral votes altogether. So they have 2 electoral districts. Whoever wins each of the districts gets 1 of the votes, and whoever wins the overall state gets 2 of the votes. And the same system works in Nebraska as well. Other states have abandoned that system a while back, but there are calls for it to be brought back sometimes. It makes things a little more interesting and a little more competitive in a certain sense. So overall, what does this system do? Like, who does it favor and who does it penalize? Obviously, it favors the small states because, for example, in Wyoming, you've got somewhere like 400,000 people or less to make up 1 electoral vote. I think, no, it's actually something like 200,000 for an electoral vote, because they have 600,000 people and they've got 3 electoral votes. And California, it takes 700,000 to make up an electoral vote. So there is a kind of a bias against the bigger states in favor of the smaller states in that system. That was by design. And the reason for that was that when the United States was being, when the United States powers were being distributed at the beginning by the fathers of the Constitution, the smaller states were afraid of being dominated by the bigger states. And they said, look, if you want to form a union of these 13 colonies, each of which was separately administered by Great Britain, we will only join the union on condition that our power is not diluted by the bigger states, and the bigger states won't just be able to outvote us all the time. And in those days, the bigger states were Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York. And, the smaller states were like Delaware and Connecticut and Rhode Island. And, part of the deal was that their voices had to be heard. So this idea of having 2 senators per state, no matter what the population was firmly established right from the very beginning. As much as it seems to be undemocratic, because a big state like California has 2 senators and a small population state like Wyoming has 2 senators, or Alaska has 2 senators. That's the system that the US has decided on, and it's stayed fixed like that all the time. And so, that results in a more powerful position for the smaller states vis-a-vis the larger states. Now, the indirect way of voting that I just mentioned results in the attempt to win over the states that are marginal, that are swing states, because the electoral votes of the states that are not marginal have already been more or less decided. So it doesn't matter by how much you win an election. It doesn't matter if you win an election in a state by 1 vote or 1 million votes. The number of electoral votes that are cast is the same. So candidates, therefore, will not concentrate at all on states that have even huge populations, like the state of California, or the state of New York, or even the state of Florida, or the state of Texas, which are the 4 biggest states. None of those states are considered marginal or swing states, and therefore the candidates have not campaigned in any of those states to try to come close to the voters. So the system of electoral college means that it's only the marginal states that count. And since it's a winner-take-all system, whoever wins one state, in a certain sense, takes away all that vote from the loser and puts it onto the winner. So there's big stakes involved in winning over a state, even if you win it over by a very few votes. In the last election, Arizona, which has millions of people, the winning margin was only 11,000 votes. And had 40,000 votes changed places in the last election, Trump would have won. And it looks like the same thing is going to be happening this time. So there's only 7 marginal states this time around: Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. And if you'll notice, all these candidates, the 2 of them, are doing all their appearances in those states. And it's not just appearances, it's millions and millions of dollars of ads on TV, radio, internet, and everything else aimed at the residents and voters of those particular states. If the system were different, obviously the campaign would be different and it would be much more spread out. And the people would have a much better chance of meeting their candidates if the system were different. I mean, in our system, when the contestants run for election, it is true that they will appear in marginal districts, but those districts are spread all across the country and they're not just aiming at one particular state. Now, imagine if we had that system in Canada. Imagine if we had the electoral college system in Canada. In Ontario and Quebec, between the 2 provinces, you have about 2/3 of the people in the whole country. So that would mean, theoretically, that the candidates would only campaign in Ontario and Quebec because those are the only places that you would have to win in order to win the electoral college. And even if you want all the other provinces put together, you wouldn't be able to become the leader of the country. So it does have a kind of a skewing effect on how the presidential campaigns are run, how money is spent, how resources are allocated. And for better or for worse, that's the way it goes. Now, the compromise of allowing small states more power in the electoral vote system was not the only compromise that the fathers of the American Constitution figured on. They made up another compromise, a much more controversial one, we'll call it. And that is that the southern states in the United States insisted that all the slaves who were living in those states be counted as residents of the states, because obviously they lived there. And if you're counting all the residents, you would have to count all the slaves too. It should be pointed out that in the olden days, in the 1700s and in the beginning of even up until the 1830s and 40s, that there were more slaves in many of the southern states than there were non-slaves, that there were more Black people living in the southern states than there were white people living in the southern states. So what the leaders of the South wanted was that every slave be counted as a person. So that would increase their population, and therefore that would increase their number of electoral votes. And yet, of course, the slaves didn't have the right to vote. So that would give the white people in the states, in those southern states, extra powers. The southern states, remember, well, at the beginning and even, when the United States expanded into the 1850s, included not only the southern states, but states like Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, which were slave states, even though those, and Missouri, even though those states did not join the Confederate side in the Civil War. So the number of slaveholding states was quite large. And besides that, there were some slaves that also lived in northern states, but relatively few in percentage terms. So a compromise was reached by the fathers of the Constitution to count each slave as 3/5 of a person. So they said, well, we can't give you full credit for the slaves that you have because they're not voting. At the same time, we want you to be part of the country. And we will therefore allot 3/5 of a person to count in the census for every slave. The reason the southern states wanted that, of course, was, of course, to get more power. But the way they saw it, the northern states still had more people altogether than the southern states had. And they just wanted to balance off the scale a little bit. Because, of course, the southern states were always afraid that at one point or other, the North would want to abolish slavery, and that would undermine the economies of the southern states. And so they needed as much power in the federal system as possible to prevent that from happening. Of course, we know that 80 years later, from 1780 to 1860, the Civil War did break out and did result over the issue of slavery, and did result for slavery being abolished, but it was done not in a legislative way, but because of the Civil War happening and the southern states losing the Civil War. So those were two compromises that were done when the system was set up. Why didn't the American system pick a direct vote for president? Why not just say one man, one vote overall? And even if the slaves couldn't vote, that would still kind of would still mean one man, one vote. And the founders of the country did it because they were afraid of what the people might vote for. So there was a fear among the leadership of the country that uneducated people, radical people, poor people might vote for a president who would not act in the best interests of the country, but would act in the best interests of these what they call the mob that would vote them in. In other words, they might say, well, let's spend all the tax money to help poor people, and therefore the people paying the taxes will not benefit from the taxes that were being paid, but the poor people who had no stake in the country and didn't contribute anything, that these people would end up getting all the benefit. So there was a fear of what they called mob rule in those times. And we have to say that at the beginning, the franchise, in other words, the right to vote, was only given to men, of course, that goes without saying, but also to men who had some sort of skin in the game. In other words, if you were a taxpayer by means of having a business, a bank account, or a land holding, you were registered to vote. And other people at the very beginning were not registered to vote. The idea being that it should only be taxpayers deciding on how their tax money should be spent. That was the sort of philosophy of the system in those days. But it was very quickly changed to allowing universal suffrage to white males over the age of 21. Let's see here. Yeah, I would point out that the compromise that allowed blacks to be counted as people, but not for them not to be allowed to vote, in effect, lasted really until 1964, believe it or not. That even though in 1865 the Civil War ended and the blacks were given the right to vote shortly after the Civil War, it was only 10 years later that their right to vote was effectively canceled. because the states took over the administration of the elections at that point, 10 years later, and they just decided not to allow blacks to vote, not in practical terms, but not in legal terms. So really, until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in the southern states, the blacks could barely vote. There were all kinds of roadblocks put in their place, including things like a poll tax, including things like a literacy test, including things like a knowledge of the state constitution test, and just plain simple not allowing them to register to vote. So it was only after 1964 that blacks could then vote. And you would have to say that the enthusiasm of the black voters in, especially in the southern states, was something that allowed President Biden to win over the state of Georgia for the Democrats for the first time since the changeover in the 1960s, where Southern whites changed from being Democrats to being Republicans. The example of the College of Cardinals was one that was sort of taken up by the fathers of the Constitution. In other words, how is a pope chosen in the Catholic Church? Not every single Catholic got a right to vote for who the pope was, but it's done by the College of Cardinals, which in other words are people who are eminently educated, responsible, and respectable, and they themselves would be the ones to elect the pope, who would then, of course, be considered to be infallible. So you had this kind of intermediate step between the citizens and the president, which would be the College of Electors. The way it was envisioned by the fathers was that these people themselves would not be politicians, that these people would be just esteemed citizens who on their own and independently and without any party favor would then go and pick who they wanted to be president. And so the voting at the beginning was you voted for the electors. You didn't vote for the president themselves. You voted for who you wanted to be an elector in your state, and those electors would then pick the president. But very quickly, very, very quickly after the system was invented, people started associating themselves in political parties. And it was political parties who kind of ran and who picked the slate of electors. And that wasn't the vision of James Madison and the other people in the US who sort of invented the system. They wanted a kind of what we would call a sort of senatorial wisdom to pick the president, irregardless of your own political leanings, let's say. But that whole idea was quickly abandoned. Let's see now. Yeah. And originally, the way they envisioned the system was that in the Electoral College, when the election took place, the winner of the most Electoral College votes would be the president, and the loser would become the vice president. And then what happened one time, and I was mentioning this, was that there was a tie in the Electoral College vote. So that means that the same number of people voted for candidate A and the same number voted for candidate B. So there couldn't be a president and a vice president. And the whole election was then shifted over to the House of Representatives, who then picked the president. So after that, they decided to get rid of this whole idea of saying that the loser becomes the vice president, and then you would go just for the president themselves, the way it works now. So to give you an idea, then I'm going to just go through again. I was mentioning some of these numbers of how the distribution of power changed in the United States over the years. Remember that there were 81 electoral votes in 1788, and there's 538 now. So New Hampshire in 1788 had 5 votes. Today they have 4 votes, meaning obviously that their power has completely diminished. In 1812 to 16, Vermont had 8 votes, and now they have 3. So you can imagine by how much Vermont's pull in the country has changed. Pennsylvania had 38 electoral votes from 1912 to 1928, and they now have 19. So that's half the number that they had back in 1928. And by the way, the number of electoral votes did not change much since 1900. The changes were that Alaska and Hawaii became states, so they each got electoral votes. 4 in the case of Hawaii and 3 in the case of Alaska. But the last change was finally in the 1960s when the District of Columbia, which isn't a state and therefore doesn't have a senator and therefore doesn't have the right to have electoral votes, nonetheless, it was decided that in all fairness, that Washington, D.C. should be having a say in who selects the president. So they were, even though they don't have a senator, they were allotted, because they're not a state, they were allotted 3 electoral votes. In other words, the minimum amount of electoral votes that any other state has was given to DC. And so they do have 3 electoral votes. So that's how the number of electoral votes went up from 535 to 538 as it is now. But think of it. I mean, Pennsylvania had 38 electoral votes in the 1920s. They only have 19 now. It just shows by how much the proportion of the US population has changed over the years. In 1844, when Texas joined the United States, they had 4 electoral votes, and now they have 40. So that's 10 times the number. Massachusetts had 10 in 1788. They were 10 out of 81, so meaning that Massachusetts was 1/8 of the population of the whole country at the beginning, and now they've got 11 out of 538. So it tells you again how the population has changed over time, and the power in the United States has changed over time to the faster growing states from the slower growing states. Now, there have been attempts over the years to change this electoral vote system. One of the dangers of the system was just pointed out to us in the last election, which is that even after all the electoral votes are decided upon, it's up to the vice president to deposit the total result of the electoral votes to the United States Congress to certify who becomes the president. And of course, we all remember that President Trump urged his vice president not to certify the results, and therefore the whole election would be thrown out and thrown in the lap of the House of Representatives. So a new rule was passed just in the last Congress to say that the vice president doesn't have the right not to certify the results, that he's just a formal sort of collector of the electoral votes to be deposited with the Congress. And the idea of changing the system would be one to change the system in order to make the vote more competitive. So you could have all the districts each elect their own electoral vote, and in that way, the close districts in all the country would be campaigned in by the president, not just the ones in the state as a whole. And also by doing that, you would have much more turnout. The turnout in American elections is really quite low compared to the other Western democracies. And part of the reason for this is that if there's only 7 competitive states out of 50, many people in the other 43 states would say, why bother voting? It's not going to make a difference. But if you had each and every district count, then there would be a lot more competitive districts than there are competitive states. And so, it might lead to more turnout of more voters. Of course, not, in the competitive states of today, most of the districts are not competitive. So that's a kind of counter argument. The electoral college system discouraged giving votes to women. And that's because the number of electoral votes depended on population, not on the number of votes. And so it didn't matter whether women voted or not, because their votes didn't count, because whether you won by one vote or 1,000 votes, you still had the same number of electoral votes. And in fact, people have researched the giving of the votes to women, and did it make any difference in how the country voted once the women had the vote? And most of the research came to say that it didn't make much of a difference, and that in those days, women voted pretty well on the same proportion as the men voted. Of course, today we know that's so different. In the current election, roughly 60% of women support the Democrats, and roughly 40 or 43% of men support the Democrats. So, in other words, there's almost a complete inversion of support, 60-40 for women to men for Democrats, and 40-60 of men to women for Democrats. So it really is quite a difference in today's election. But in the old days, it wasn't really quite as drastic as that. The other non-democratic aspects of the American election is that American citizens who live in Puerto Rico or Guam or the Virgin Islands or American Samoa or the Northern Mariana Islands, and these are all territories belonging to the US, all the people who live in those territories are American citizens. They don't have any say in who gets to be president, because those territories have no senators, and therefore they have no electoral votes. So this is a kind of a flaw, I would say, in the American system, that these people, including the people of Puerto Rico, which of course is the biggest one of these places that I just mentioned, they don't have a say in who gets to be the president of the United States. It also has a huge disadvantage to third parties. And this is really important as well, because it's impossible. If a third party doesn't win all of the electoral votes in one state, then they don't have any electoral votes whatsoever. And so to mount a campaign is so costly. To get television ads and to recruit buses and volunteers and everything else is so costly that if you have no possible chance of winning a state, why go through the whole motion? And so third parties have not been very successful in the United States at all since the 1960s campaign of George Wallace, when the southern states were still very firmly segregationist, and he ran on a segregationist platform, and he won the Electoral College in many of the southern states. But ever since then, and before then, third parties have been notoriously unsuccessful. Ross Perot, he ran as a third party candidate. He got somewhere around 15% of the vote, but no electoral votes at all. He didn't win a single state. So this electoral college system really prevents a kind of a broader representation of different ideas in the United States, whereas in a British parliamentary system, whether it's in Great Britain or Canada, you do have two big parties, but you've also got smaller regional parties or smaller other parties who do get some voice elected in their parliaments, and therefore their voters have some sort of representation. And I would say this idea of a two-party system in the U.S. has led to such divisions and such great animosity and such great misunderstandings between the two parties that if there were more parties involved, the differences would not be so stark between the two major parties. And so this is another flaw in the American system. Let's have a look-see. Now let's just, I'm going to just very kind of briefly, in a way, look at the current campaign and where we stand. And it is one, like I said, where the current polls are showing that in the 7 competitive states, there isn't a leader who is leading by more than 1% in any of those 7 states. And since the margin of error is in these polls is usually around 3%, it means that if you look at the poll, the candidates could either be getting 3% more or 3% less than the poll results show, meaning that if there isn't a difference of more than 1%, then the whole thing is a tie or a toss-up, and it all will depend on the totals of voters on election day. It also shows that there are very few people in the United States who haven't made up their minds. Somewhere under 10% of the people, 7% in one poll that I was reading, are undecideds. So pretty well, it's very hard then for the candidates to convince voters who can't make up their minds who to vote for. It's much more profitable for a candidate to try to get their own supporters to show up to vote instead of staying home. And this, in some way or other, may explain the strategy of the Republicans to rather than try to become more moderate and more compromising, to go ahead and re-emphasize the strong points of their candidate. In other words, to be very tough on immigration, to be tough on crime, to be tough on tariffs, because the stronger you seem to be, the more you will encourage your own voters to actually show up to vote rather than sitting at home. And this kind of strategy, in a certain sense, divides the country even more, because there is fewer points of agreement between the two parties than points of difference. The other main difference between today's elections and those elections of a generation ago has to do with the media. And the media plays a very large role in educating the public, because obviously that's where the public gets their information and news from. And in today's media, because you have alternative sources of media with no standard of truth, the different sides will only listen to their own media, and therefore they will get completely different versions of what life is like in America and what the reality is in America. On the one hand, you have Donald Trump saying that America is going to hell, that if you vote for Miss Harris, then the whole country will end up looking like Detroit, saying that immigrants are overrunning the country, that these immigrants are bringing crime and crime is overrunning the country, that American jobs are being stolen by foreign businesses, and that America is a weak country without any respect whatsoever. So the message of Donald Trump is a very negative one, saying that only he can rescue the country from going down the tubes. The message of Kamala Harris is pretty well the opposite, that America has good things and that there is hope for the future and America has made a lot of progress, and that the country is stronger when it's united among all of its different groups than to try to set groups off one against another. So in other words, you could say one has an optimistic message and one has a pessimistic message, but depending on who you are as an individual and how you feel about your own current situation, a lot of that will push how you vote. And if you are fearful for the future, and if you see that your standard of living is gone down or that other people's have gone up and yours has stayed the same, then you might be inclined to vote for the Republicans and vice versa. So it's a very kind of subjective kind of way of looking at things, because even though the economy in general has done well, and even though inflation has gone down in the United States, and even though certainly crime has gone down in the United States as a whole, individuals may not perceive these things because either for them these things are not true, or because the media that they listen to have told them that these things are not true. So sometimes the individual's perceptions differ from what the reality actually is. And that's just the way things go. That's just the way things are. The sad part of it is that there is no objective truth that people are willing to listen to on any subject, whether it's on COVID or COVID vaccines, or whether it's on inflation, or whether it's on the number of immigrants crossing the border, or whether it's on the unemployment rate, or whether it's on the growth of the economy. People are taught to doubt and to disbelieve any kind of official statistics because they say this is a government plot and the government is out to take advantage of us or to misinform us. And things, as you know, have gotten to the point where politicians have stated that the government has controlled the hurricanes, that the government caused the hurricanes in order to disadvantage Republican voters. And I mean, all kinds of nonsense is, flying around the internet. And unfortunately, there are people who believe and who live in this world. And if you live in this world, then obviously you're going to vote in this world. And, that explains the enduring popularity of a candidate who otherwise has had 34 convictions for criminal behavior, who has, lied so many times about so many unimportant things, people eating cats and all kinds of ridiculous statements, which don't seem to discourage people because the media that they consume doesn't criticize these type of speeches and behaviors. So let's just finish off by talking about how we might be affected by the election of President Trump, the former president, because he's doubled down on his idea of tariffs. And just to talk a touch about tariffs, because it seems to be one of his most important electoral issues. And tariffs mean that you put a tax on imports coming into your country. And what that means is that if you import something from another country, the government itself will charge a tariff on that item. The tariff would have to be paid before this item is allowed into the country. And therefore, the cost of that item will go up to the consumers in that country, thereby encouraging manufacturers in that very country to make the article which would not be subjected to tariffs. So in its most simplest form, then, tariffs are done to encourage local supply and to discourage importing from other countries. Now, for the first, in the first instance, of course, tariffs lead to higher prices because somebody has to pay those tariffs, somebody has to pay those taxes, and it's always the consumer in the end who pays. Um, Even if there is a manufacturer who will make the item in the same way, that manufacturer can then charge more for its product because he's competing against the import, which now costs a certain percentage more. The most glaring example of this is in the electric cars or electric vehicles, EV imports, where the US has put on a 100% tariff on Chinese electrical vehicles, and Canada has followed suit on that same thing in order to, theoretically, in order to encourage the production of electrical vehicles in North America, and in a much more direct way to discourage people from buying cheap Chinese electrical vehicles, thereby skewing the market for all kinds of cars produced in North America. What Trump says is that these tariffs just will make the economy stronger. But we know from history, from past economic history, whether in South America or whether in Europe, that tariffs, in a sense, not in a sense, but tariffs actually hurt the economy because there is less competition, there is less incentive for local manufacturers to improve their products because they've got no competition coming in from the outside. That it ends up in a kind of a concentration of wealth and concentration of production in the hands of a few strong companies, which don't allow smaller companies to emerge. And remember that if one country puts a tariff on another country, the other country will retaliate by putting tariffs on that country. So in the end, of course, you have a trade war, and the only people who lose out are the consumers because prices end up going so high for all kinds of goods. When Trump put tariffs on imports into the US, Europe put tariffs on exports from the US. So they put tariffs on whiskey. They put tariffs on things that were visible to the individual consumer. So, Jim Beam whiskey and Jack Daniels whiskey was tariffed, and Harley Davidson motorcycles were tariffed, and all this type of thing ends up with a trade war where nobody ends up winning. And all the sort of neutral economists have explained this fact of life to Trump and to the Democrats to say that a tariff war doesn't advantage anybody, but disadvantages everybody except for those few manufacturers who are favored by the tariffs. One of the best proofs of this is that in Latin America in general, pretty well for the whole 20th century, they had a very strong tariff policy in order to encourage local production in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, and other countries like that. And overall, the economy of Latin America grew much more slowly than the economies even of course, of Asia, but also of North America and Europe, who did not have this kind of super protectionistic policy. So they really don't work. But politically, they sound very good. And when Trump goes to a Midwestern town in Ohio and says, look, all your jobs have gone to China, and now you're buying Chinese products and you're giving them your money, it sounds good. But, in a macroeconomic policy way, it's not good. So I think I'm gonna stop now. Let you collect your thoughts. Let you think about what you might want to comment on. Ask any questions you like. And I'll be sitting here waiting for you to comment and to ask some questions. And I also wanted to add that these broadcasts are on YouTube. I didn't know this, but they are. And my granddaughter, who Googled me, saw that I was on YouTube, and I became the biggest star in her eyes because I'm on YouTube with 7 likes. So if you want to look at these classes afterward, they are available on YouTube for you to go and listen to it again. So thanks again for listening. And I'm here to have you put up your hands and to ask any questions you like. And I'll be back next week, next Tuesday, back in Cote-Saint-Luc in the library. So thanks again.
We await questions.
And so Maria is the hostess. And any comments, you don't have to have a question. You can just give a comment, and you can say, for example, well, which system do you prefer to choose a leader, our Canadian British system or the American system? Which do you think has a more logical way? Remember that in the American system, you actually get to vote for who the president is. His name or her name is right on the ballot, and you can put an X beside that name. In our system, you can't do that. So a lot of people say, well, I'd much rather be the one voting directly for the leader rather than this indirect system that we have. So, like I said, there's advantages and disadvantages to each system. And, there is no perfect system.
No questions so far.
Okay, well, you know what? We'll wait a bit and see what happens. I tried really to make people understand how the mechanism works, and it's worth understanding this because if you don't have a really good understanding of it, it all seems like such a confusing muddle, the American system, and I would just say that it re-emphasizes the importance of the individual states in how the president of the whole country is selected. And it's important to understand that because America was formed as a union of the 13 colonies, which each became independent from Great Britain and then decided to join together as a country. And our system, the provinces don't matter whatsoever in how the federal elections are held and have no say whatsoever in who the leader of our country is. So there really is 2 different emphases in that way.
So we have a question from an anonymous attendee saying, which candidate would be the greatest risk for Canada?
In the American elections, it for sure would be it would be the former President Trump. And that's because he has a very strong America First philosophy. And whether you are close to America or even in the NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement, which he says he wants to rip up, his whole way of looking at the world is a kind of a winner take all system or a zero sum game system, meaning if you gain something, I lose something. And his whole way of looking at the world is very transactional. You do something for me and I'll do something for you. And his idea is not to say, well, let's make a partnership of say different free countries, and that way in a partnership everybody's stronger. His way of looking at things is that if America is strong, everybody else is weak, and if somebody else is strong, it makes America weak. So just on that philosophical way, he would not be the better candidate for Canada. And of course, we have to mention too that, and we all know this, that Kamala Harris spent 6 years living in Montreal, from age 12 to age 18. And it doesn't mean that she's any friendlier to Canada. It doesn't, she's never mentioned Canada or Montreal in any of her election campaigns. And that's because she doesn't want to give the people the idea that she's somehow a foreigner or a foreign agent or something like that, although it's been mentioned by Trump on several occasions. But she and President Biden have all said that the Western world is stronger if they act together than if they act separately. And that's part of her philosophy also. So from a kind of a neutral way of looking at things, for Canada, it would be better to have Harris elected than Trump. On the other hand, some might say, well, look, what's better for Canada is a very strong US economy, because the stronger the US is as an economy, Canada as a trading partner would benefit more. And therefore, whoever will deliver a strong American economy will be good for Canada. And there's truth in that as well. Although we've lost our position now by a long shot of being the US's biggest trading partner. We've dropped down to, I believe, third place behind Mexico and China as the largest trading partner for the US. But certainly, we're still important to the US in that way. I would also mention that the division in the United States is so strong, and the fear that if President Trump gets elected, he will be even more radical than he was the first time, has led to people in the United States saying that they would move to Canada if President Trump wins the election. And of course, people moving to Canada would be a good thing for Canada, because we would gain their expertise and their investments and everything else. So that's a very minor consideration. But overall, I think that it would be better for Canada if Harris wins, simply because there would be more continuity, less changes, less radical things that could pop into President Trump's head, and also perhaps less chance of international crises breaking out because of a kind of an irrational president.
We have a question from Janice. Janice, you can speak.
Go ahead, Janice.
Just got to unmute yourself.
Got it. Am I okay?
Yep.
Okay. Having said, listen to you for an hour.
Yeah.
And and
I hope it passed.
And some of it's,
I hope it wasn't too.
It
wasn't too trying.
A lot of negativity. It's still the most powerful and richest country in the world, with all the issues that they have. And you didn't mention guns. It's not relevant. But I kind of wonder about that. Why is it? They're also the most creative, I would say.
Well, richest only counts, of course, if you're measuring the total amount of output of the country, and not the income of every individual person. The United States is by far and away not the richest country when you count things by income per person. But it is as a whole, the richest country. But if you count up the total wealth of the country, up until just recently, it was predicted that China would overtake the US. If you look at just the total amount of wealth in the whole country, China's had a little bit of a slowdown. But even with the slowdown that they've had, their growth rate is in percentage is faster than the American growth rate. And it seems inevitable that at one point or other, maybe by 2040 or so, that China would overtake the US as the richest country in the world, when you're counting just the total amount of earnings or money in that country. So for sure, the United States is a world leader. It's also, of course, the largest democracy in the world. It also has probably the strongest military in the world. And so it pushes a lot of weight in the whole world. And that's why it's important, not only for Canada, but pretty well for the whole world, to see who becomes the leader of that country and what that person's policies will be. The issue of guns is something that was decided long ago in a very closely fought court case over the rights of people to own guns. And the Supreme Court, by 5-4 decision, only 5-4, decided that everyone in the United States has a right to own a gun by the Second Amendment of the Constitution, which says that people should have the right to bear arms. And that was interpreted to mean that they could own guns of any kind and any sort, and pretty well with less regulation than regulates the sale and distribution of alcohol in the country. And for sure, it's led to a crime rate and a death rate from crimes which is higher than other countries. So you might have crimes in Great Britain or even in Canada, but far less number of people die of shootings than in the United States. If the Democrats win and want to make changes, they can only really make changes around the edges. They can't make changes to the whole principle of being allowed to in an unregulated way own a firearm. So that sort of has been decided, unless the Congress itself passes some kind of rule which becomes constitution proof. The way things are in the US will have to continue to be the way they are. And unfortunately, it leads to a spreading of those weapons, not only in the United States, but to Canada and to Central America, and to gangs, because anyone has a right to purchase a weapon and then just take it out of the country, and that's how they spread around.
Someone else is asking, isn't India the largest democracy in the world?
It is. Did I say the US was? My mistake. India is the largest democracy in the world. It just had an election. And at this point, India, in terms of the economy, first of all, India is not only the largest democracy in the world, it's the largest country in the world, because its population has surpassed China's in the last 2 or 3 years. And China's population is going down and India's population is going up. So that gap is going to continue. And the growth rate of the Indian economy at over 6% way surpasses the growth rate of the Chinese economy, which, although we don't know the figures for sure, somewhere, they're saying it's somewhere around 4%. And the US growth rate is somewhere around 3%, and Canada's growth rate is somewhere around 1%. So it gives you the idea of how, relatively speaking, these economies are growing. So if you draw a line and project things in the future, at one point or other, India will, even though today India's per person income is half of China's, and China's is under half of the US. If you follow the line to the far distant future, and things keep up in the same way, then both countries will end up surpassing the US. But my mistake. I said it's the largest democracy. Maybe should have said it's the most powerful democracy.
Another question, someone's asking, who would be better for Israel in the current situation with Gaza and Lebanon, etc.?
Such a good question. Such a good question. It's been said that Mr. Netanyahu is so much in Trump's camp that he has resisted American pressure and he's resisted compromise, because he figures that if Trump wins the election, there'll be no more pressure and no need to compromise. And the answer to the question really depends on what you think is best for Israel. If you believe that Israel's only best policy would be to be as most aggressive as possible against all of its enemies around the country and against the Palestinians within Israel, then President Trump, of course, would encourage that type of policy. If you believe, on the other hand, that in the long run, the only good thing, the only solution for Israel is to make some sort of accommodation with its neighbors, including the Palestinians, and that otherwise it just leads to endless warfare, then obviously the Democrats would be more willing to encourage that sort of policy. So it sort of a bit depends on what you think is best for Israel. The identification of Trump and Netanyahu are so strong that Netanyahu tried to establish a settlement in the Golan Heights and call it Kiryat Trump, or Trump Village, in order to sort of praise Trump to the skies. So, that's the answer to that question. We all know that the Biden administration has put pressure on Israel not to retaliate against Iran by attacking their nuclear facilities or the oil facilities. We know that Biden has put pressure on Israel not to kill too many civilians in the war against Gaza. We know that Biden has put pressure on Israel not to invade Lebanon. So these are all, in a way, breaks, America's attempt to break Israel's military intentions. And one would assume that Trump would tell Israel to do whatever it wants. The question, of course, is that if Israel does what it wants, is this the best thing for Israel in the long run? So that's the question that there is no answer to, and people in Israel are completely divided in half on those questions. Well, not divided in half, but are divided on what the best outcome for Israel would be. So that answers that. You could say that the Western world in general tries to act sort of in a certain united way against all sort of foreign threats. And that if Trump becomes president, then he divides the Western world and he says, I, America, will act alone, and I will not be responsible even for our membership in NATO, and I won't defend other countries if they get invaded, and I'm a friend of Russia, and I'm a friend of all of Russia's friends. Well, then it may well end up being that Trump would be, more sort of on Russia's side and on Russia's friend's side than on Israel's side. It's with President Trump, you would never know what he thinks or who he's in favor of, because the last person he speaks to is the one who influences them the most, and the one who rewards him with money directly or indirectly is the one who influences him the most. So I would caution people who think that Trump is so good for Israel to double think it, because if some of Israel's enemies end up paying him, he will change his idea in an instant. And you might have heard, of course, his comments about American Jews, saying that if American Jews vote for Democrats, then they're traitors to their country. So, he's not the great prize that people sort of think of in American politics. As far as the American Jewish vote is concerned, it's still more or less 70% Democratic, and that hasn't changed in a very long time. But the supporters of Trump who are Jewish are very strong supporters of his. So, we have to mention that also as well. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like that's all our questions for today. Good questions, though.
Okay, great questions. And thank you so much, Maria. And
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, people, for listening in and asking such good questions. And I hope to see you all again in person next Tuesday.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin.
Bye.